Hi everyone, welcome to The First Few. The First Few is kind of a digital experiment with Holy Week as we track with Jesus as he makes his way to the cross. Today is Monday and we're going to be in Matthew chapter 21 and we're going to look at verses 12 through 17. I'm going to read through the text. I want to point out, 4 or 5 things about the text that's fairly significant, and then, we'll land on a couple of takeaways because it's kind of what we do. So here we go. Matthew 21, starting there in verse 12. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers.'" And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. And they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, 'Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies have you prepared praise'?" And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. Okay, let's point out a few things about the text. The first one is, yes, there's some consideration of where this section of scripture should actually fall. Does it happen right after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, or is it actually on Monday? Different gospel writers will put it at different points, but there is really no doubt that it happened. This is significant. All the writers want to point to it because Jesus is doing something very special with this passage. Okay, number 2, second thing. There's the issue of the tables themselves. Jesus goes into the temple and he starts to overturn the tables of the money changers and those who sold pigeons. So paying the temple tax in Jerusalem had to be paid with a very specific coin, and there needed to be a place for money to be exchanged as pilgrims are coming from outside the Jerusalem area to Jerusalem to pay the tax and to worship and sacrifice and so forth. So that was a necessary service. And then there's also those who sold pigeons. Now, pigeons are about the lowest common denominator of sacrifice in the time that Jesus is living, walking, and doing ministry. So again, these people were offering a service for the poor and those who have come from far afield to actually come to Jerusalem and make their sacrifice. The issue with what's taking place, as one scholar puts it, and which I absolutely love, is not assuming their business practices were sound, assuming they weren't price gouging and taking advantage of people in that exchange, which would have been an issue. Assuming that the business practices were sound, there was a great issue with the location of these tables. Apparently, they were allowed to set up shop in the outer court of the temple. And we know that the outer court of the temple was a place where the nations were supposed to be able to gather and pray in proximity to where everything was taking place in the Holy of Holies. And that's why Jesus makes this reference to the house of God. It's supposed to be a house of prayer. And so he turns over these tables and all that. Okay, third thing is the scale of what's taking place. What Jesus does here in this passage is very significant because it's not large enough to start a riot, and it's not large enough to have Rome coming and crashing down on this teacher who has come from Galilee, but it's big enough that it does draw attention from the chief priests, and it does get them to perk up and see what's going on. See, the ministry of Jesus, it was well known enough and it was big enough to have the right people asking some very big questions. What Jesus is doing here in the temple, it looks and feels a whole lot like an Old Testament prophet making God's point to God's people. Indeed, in this passage, there are several references and allusions, almost a half a dozen, to things happening in the Old Testament. Passages from Jeremiah and the Psalms and Malachi especially. Jesus is making a point and he's drawing people in to listen and see what God is doing. Okay, the fourth thing. There's a powerful transposition of Jesus and David. Jesus coming into the city of Jerusalem to the shouts and acclamations of the people, and Jesus going into the temple complex to the shouts and acclamation of those of the blind and the lame and even children offering up their voices. It's in direct contrast to the way that David was forced to leave Jerusalem to the mockery of the blind and the lame and children. Jesus is the one who has the right to rule. Jesus is the one who, in coming to Jerusalem, is coming to his own. And Matthew captures this for us so very well. And the fifth thing, well, there's a song of the children in general. It's these children recognizing what is taking place. When the chief priests, when the scribes, when the Pharisees, when the Sadducees, everyone who is there, the learned intelligentsia of the Jewish faith of the day, does not see what God is doing. It's children who recognize the truth that is all but self-evident and are praising the one, whether they fully understand it or not. They recognize that something has happened and it's something that's special. And so they offer up their praise. So let's talk about this text and what it could possibly mean for us. I think there are a couple of logical takeaways. I think the first one would be, don't stand in the way of what God is doing. Don't get in the way of what God might be doing around you. We are supposed to be a people who are a signpost to the things of God. We are supposed to direct people to the love of God, to the things that God has accomplished. We are supposed to live a life of a contagious faith that points people to a real and loving Savior. Sometimes the way we conduct ourselves and the way we act isn't necessarily in a capacity that draws people in. Sometimes it can turn people away. In a week that's dedicated to the things and actions of Jesus, there might be an opportunity for the people of God to evaluate self and see, are we drawing people in? And ask ourselves that question. I think the second takeaway from this text is, don't miss what God is doing. God is moving. God is active. He is working all around us. We have bright moments of opportunities to see the things that He is doing and to offer up praise. We shouldn't miss those moments. Sometimes we program ourselves to the nth degree. Sometimes we get so busy in doing stuff, we miss these opportunities to sit back. It's like, God, I see this and I recognize you for who you are, and just worship Him in those. Even if the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees had the best possible motivations, and there's no guarantee that they did, they were missing what God was doing. But Jesus points to the kids and their childlike faith and holds them up as an example. May we be a people who point people to Jesus. May we be a people who recognize what God is doing and respond to it.